Greetings. I'm Howard Gardner. I'm a research professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm speaking today from my office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's a wintry but not very cold day in December. Thank you for your kind invitation to speak about my work and to address a few questions which were forwarded to me. I'm going to begin by giving you some background, which I hope will be helpful in understanding the questions, responses that I've created for you today. My own work has gone through three separate phases over the years. I began as a psychologist, a research psychologist. I studied cognitive development and cognitive breakdown for about a decade. I worked with students of all ages and with brain damage patients. And this research led to the work which probably you know about, if you know about my work at all, the theory of multiple intelligences. And very, very briefly, MI theory claims that the notion of a single intelligence, which you can test with one instrument, doesn't make sense, because the human mind is not just a single computer, it's a bunch of computers which are relatively independent of one another. So we have a language computer, we have a logical computer, we have a musical computer, we have a spatial computer, we have a computer about understanding other people and so on. And these computers are relatively independent of one another. We all know this because if somebody is good in music or bad in music, we really can't predict how they're going to be with language or how they're going to be with finding their way around an unfamiliar territory or figuring out how to bargain with somebody. So in a nutshell, that's the theory of multiple intelligences. I wrote about multiple intelligences chiefly as a psychologist for other psychologists, but I didn't predict that the chief interest in the theory would come from educators. And so for almost 40 years, a lot of my work has been in education, about curricula, about assessment, about how best to teach, how students learn. And I've actually avoided creating MI tests, multiple intelligence tests or multiple intelligences curricula. I prefer to think of this as a way of thinking about things rather than as another form of instrumentation. I do talk about two aspects which I think really have educational implications. I call them personalization and pluralization. Personalization means know as much as you can about every student and try to teach that student or have that student learn in ways that are comfortable for that student. And that's much easier now than it was in earlier times, because with technology, there are many ways in which we can individuate curricula, even if we have many students in a classroom. That wouldn't have been possible 50 years ago. Pluralization has always been possible, but it's not done very often. It's when you are teaching something, decide what's really important about that topic, and then teach it in lots of different ways, not just through words, not just through pictures, not just through action, dialogue, jokes, but rather through a variety of forms of presentation. And if you teach pluralistically, you reach more students and you give every person a better chance of what it means to understand. Because if you understand something, you can think about it more than one way. If you can only think about it in one way, your understanding is quite limited. So that was the second phase of my work. For the last 25 years, I've focused increasingly on policy, on what kinds of minds we should be developing and how education should evolve, and also in what kind of a world do we want to live in, what kind of human beings do we want to nurture and sculpt and fashion. And much of that work recently has been at the college level, which is rather different than universities in other countries. In many of our colleges, we do what's called liberal arts education, which is a broad form of education. And I'll talk about that because one of the questions that was posed to me was about what we call the real world of college. So you're hearing from a person who's had three broad periods. One is a psychologist who created the theory of multiple intelligences. One as an educator who's thought a lot about how to teach, how to assess, how to encourage, how to nurture, what we should teach, and so on. And finally, as somebody interested in broader questions of policy, what should higher education be like, and what kinds of human beings, what kinds of workers what kinds of citizens do we want to try to nurture in the 21st century. So that's the background. I'm now going to move to the 4 questions that were sent to me. The first question said, there's so much information available now, is it still possible to learn by doing? Well, if you were a student of mine, I would say, the only way to learn is by doing. The only way to learn is by doing and performing. But we shouldn't just be spitting back what we've been taught. So it's not enough to memorize all the capitals or all the rivers of Latin America and give them back, or to memorize all the timetables. That's not really understanding. Understanding is taking a concept or a practice that you've learned about and use it appropriately in new situations. These are what we call performances of understanding. We've written a great deal about this. Much of it's available in Spanish, but I'll use a specific example. I've just told you the theory of multiple intelligences, and I could have run through the 7 or 8 intelligences. And if I said to you, well, what are the intelligences? That's doing, but that's a very banal form of doing, because all I have to do is to take up my phone and say Gardner's intelligences, and the answers are there. There's no point in wasting time memorizing that. But I've said to you, okay, now that you've heard about the theory of multiple intelligences, how might you teach differently? Or how might you think about students differently? Or if you were to create an assessment, how would you do it? That's a performance of understanding, because unless you understand my ideas in some detail, you wouldn't know how to perform that understanding. So doing is fine. Parroting back is for the 19th century. It's always doing things which show that you can take the ideas, the concepts, the facts, and use them appropriately in new situations. The second question had to do with my work about college students. In a book recently published with Wendy Fishman, we argue that in America, our college students fall into 4 different categories, which we call inertial, transactional, transformational, and exploratory. A student who is inertial simply says, well, I went to secondary school, now I'm going to college or university, and has no other reason for being there except it's the next step on the ladder. Fortunately, we don't have too many inertial students, but we have huge numbers of transactional students who say, I'm going to college so I can get a degree and get a good job. And they never think about anything else. And of course, this isn't just what they think, it's many of the messages which our society gives. Now, if a school is a vocational school and it says it's training you to be a plumber or an engineer or a journalist, then its obligation is to do that. Everything else is a bonus. I think it's a worthwhile bonus. But if you call yourself a general college, a liberal arts school, then your obligation is not simply to help people get a job, particularly because in most cases, the job will disappear in 3 years. And then what will you do? In fact, talking to you on the middle of December, I just read that college students are not being encouraged anymore to go into computer science because 11,000 workers were just dropped from Microsoft and so on. So the job is a very it's a short-sighted way of thinking about work, about school. The 2 stances that we recommend for students, which means that schools have to promote them, are to be exploratory and to be transformational. Exploratory means this is a once in a lifetime to stretch, to study an art form you've never studied before, to study a different part of the world that you haven't studied before, to study a science that you haven't studied before, to be in a glee club or to be in the Student United Nations. And at least in the United States, the 4 years between secondary school and professional school or workplace is a wonderful opportunity to explore. And here's the 4th form, to be transformed. Nobody should go to college to become a different kind of person. In many ways, we should be the kind of persons we came there with, and we should reflect values from our home and from our family, but we should be open to think differently about things, to think differently about ourselves, to think differently about our role of ourselves. In the terms that Wendy and I favor, to think more about we and less about I. I don't know how much of a problem this is in Latin America, but in the United States, people are obsessed with I and me. Our students use the terms I and me 11 times more often than they see we or us, and their parents do it 22 times as much. So being prepared to be transformed in a way where you think more about others, I think is a very worthy goal of college. Well, when this question was posed to me by your host, they said to me, how do the different forms of intelligence relate to the four kinds of students? And the answer is they don't really. Anybody can be an inertial student, just going to the next place. Anybody could be a transactional student, just trying to get the degree, willing to cheat to get it so you can get a job. But when we talk about exploring and transforming, there's a chance that you can use some intelligences that you haven't used before, or use them in a different way. My own teacher, Nelson Goodman, used to teach a course on philosophy of art. And most of the students who took the course were interested in an art form like music or drama or theater. And so Goodman would say, fine, for this assignment, I want you to pick an art form you've never worked in before and do something with it. And that was explore, and you might discover you were actually quite good at writing comedy or at designing a dance, even though you never did it before. So that's exploring in order to be transformational. That's the second question. The third question is, you're interested in ethics. Why are you interested in ethics, and what's the problem with ethics in the United States? Well, I've already touched on that. Our students and our families are very, very transactional, and they don't think much about what the right thing to do is. They just think about, how can we get ahead in a kind of selfish way. This is a mammoth change in American colleges and universities. 150 years ago, they were all about ethics and religion. Now, I'm not sure I would have liked the way they handled ethics and religion, and our schools became much more secular rather than sectarian, much less religious and much more about values in general. And I would have thought some years ago that that was a good thing. But now that we've discovered the ethical vacuum at the part of so many of our colleges and universities, I think it's very, very important to rethink what it means to be an ethical person. And in our own work, we focus on two kinds of ethics, being an ethical worker and an ethical citizen. Everybody, when they leave college or university, is going to be a worker of some sort, unless they're tremendously wealthy. And they're all going to be citizens of their community, of their state, their country, and in a global climate challenged world, they're a citizen of the planet. So what does it mean to be a good worker, a good citizen? It has three elements. One, you're excellent. You know what you're doing. And that's what education typically does. Two, you're ethical. You go about it in a way that's thoughtful, and you say, not just how is this good for me, but how is this good for others? When I do work, when I vote, am I just following my own self-interest, or am I thinking about the broader community? So those are two E's, excellence and ethics. But there's this third E which we can't legislate, and that's the E of engagement. Because our research with hundreds and hundreds of students and professionals has shown it's too hard to be excellent and ethical unless you find what you're doing meaningful, unless you like going to work, unless you look forward to it. That doesn't mean that you don't look forward to weekends and vacations, but it means that you don't shudder at the notion of putting in some extra hours or stepping to help a colleague or a fellow citizen. So a lot of our work now is on how to become a good worker and a good citizen. And we've created a curriculum, and that curriculum is in fact available both in Chinese and Spanish. So if you go to the Good Work Project online, goodwork.org, you can actually access those curricula. And for whatever years I have left, my primary efforts is not on promoting multiple intelligences per se, but in helping people use their intelligences to be good workers and good citizens. The last question is a question on everybody's mind, but I have to warn you, I don't have any particular special wisdom on this. And that is, how has the pandemic changed education and work? You You all wrestle with this every day, whether you're workers in the community or whether you are teachers or whether you're still students. So I can't claim to have any special insights about this. I will say that many of us have learned a lot more about ourselves, our family, our values through the pandemic, because it was easier to hide those when you were going to work every day or going to school every day and very busy. But when you're at home most of the time by yourself or with your spouse or babysitting or trying to teach your kids or your grandkids, as my wife and I do, you find a lot out about yourself, and that's probably valuable. That's what we call intrapersonal intelligence. Without doubt, through remote teaching, through Zoom, we've learned about certain things which can be done well, or even better remotely. I think that much of what's done in university and college can be done quite well, particularly if it's rather rule governed, like mathematics or certain areas of science. When you get into the humanities, history, literature, art, I think that's harder to do remotely, though of course you can do some of it quite well. I think the real issue is not higher education, but education with young people. I don't think it's ever going to make sense to do most education with preschoolers and with kids in early childhood remotely if you can possibly do it in person, even if in person means you have to wear masks or sit separate from one another or have special ventilation, because I think young people need and deserve direct contact with people of different ages. And it's not the same to look at somebody on a screen than to rub elbows with them or even to hug them, even if you have a mask on. So a lot of my work now is actually going to be about thinking about early childhood education and how we can do that better, because so much importance happens in the first years of life. And I've recently posted a blog about how teachers in 3 different cultures, China, Japan, and the United States, deal with a child who's misbehaving a great deal, and what the question is what to do with the rest of the class. And I'm not going to tell you what we found, but I'm going to tell you we're going to be surprising what we found, because these countries deal very, very differently with student misbehavior, and I think that has ramifications for what happens much later in life. But that's for another talk and another occasion. I want to close by thanking you for your attention, thanking you for the 4 questions which I tried to answer, and I hope my framing, my work as a researcher, as an educator, and as a policymaker was of some help to you in making sense of what I said. But just as I said, not everything can be done remotely. Probably this would have worked much better if I could be in the same room with you and see your reactions and answer your questions. But wishes are not always realities. All good wishes for me. Bye-bye.